everyone, welcome back to Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Today's video is my July wrap-up. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books, and today I'm going to be talking about the way too many books that I read in July. In the month of July I was participating in Austen July. But as you will see in a bit with this stack of books, I did go a little bit off the Jane Austen rails and might have gone on a little bit of a thriller reading binge, so I will show you what I read in a moment. In total, somehow, even though I didn't finish any books for ages in July it seemed, and that was why I didn't do a mid-month wrap-up, I somehow have read 17 books. 4 of these were audiobooks and the rest were all physical books. I ran into a complete slump really with ebook reading. If you're new to my channel, I primarily read physical books and listen to audiobooks, but in recent months I've been getting better at reading ebooks by borrowing them on the Libby app, and I was hopeful of doing that for a couple of books that I had on my TBR for July, but unfortunately I just had complete ebook block. Just couldn't seem to get on with them at all. I just had no desire to read books on my phone, so that happened, and that has meant that I have not read The House in the Cerulean Sea, even though I said I was going to read that for the Clunalong. And I also haven't finished reading yet One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or AJ Dunn's Killer Reads Thriller Month Book Club. And I will be finishing that. I have since purchased it on audiobook. I was originally trying to read it as an ebook and that just didn't work out for me. I do have 4 books that I've still got on the go. 2 are audiobooks. One is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which I'm not all that far into but I'm really enjoying. And also Rainbow Valley by L.M. Montgomery I'm listening to on audiobook as well for the Annealong. And I have not yet finished that either, but I'm only about 3 hours from the end of that. I will be continuing them into August despite all the trash reading I'm going to be doing. I also would really like to finish off Lady Susan. I was going to read this on an ebook as well, but I've borrowed my mum's copy so that I can get through it. And I was really enjoying this, but I have got distracted by other things and not ended up finishing Lady Susan. But that's definitely one I do want to finish in August. I would also like to finish in August a library book that I've had out for far too long, and that is Salt Lick by Lulu Allison. I originally ordered this from the library when it was on the long list for the Women's Prize, and I've had it out of the library ever since it arrived at the library and I still haven't returned it, so this does need to go back. And I'm currently about 100 pages into this one, so maybe nearly a third of the way through it. I'm quite enjoying that one. At the end of the video I'll let you know how any book hauling and book reading has affected the numbers on the Giant TBR. There was a little bit of book hauling in July. 2 books were hauled that were late birthday presents from a friend. 2 books were given to me. I won a book from the Women's Prize for Fiction from a giveaway that they did on their Instagram. And I also did buy 1 book in July. But when I come to each of those books, I will tell you about them, because although that is 6 books added to the Giant TBR, I have actually read 5 of them, so only 1 will be added onto the Giant TBR. So that's good news. So anyway, without any further ado, I'm going to go through the books that I read in the month of July, and I'm going to be talking about them roughly in the order of how much I enjoyed them. And this month I'll be talking about a good category, a very good category, and my favourites of the month. So let's get started with the good category. I read this during a bit of a thriller binge, crime fiction binge that I went on, and it is The Secret House of Death by Ruth Rendell. This was not planned on any TBR. It's a book I've had for a very long time, and it just happened to be one I decided to pick up on a whim when I fancied reading some crime and thrillers. And this wasn't particularly thrilling, it was more of a mystery. It was quite slow paced and you could really tell that it had been written in the 60s, it was a bit dated. Having said that, I really did enjoy this and read it in a day. It's very short, and I also thought that the solution to the mystery was quite good, although I do think that I guessed it shortly before it was actually revealed, so that's good. It didn't wow me, but I didn't dislike it. Next up, Death Comes to Pemberley by P.D. James. I listened to this on audiobook for one of the prompts for Jane Austen July, and I really enjoyed this to begin with. So I listened to it pretty much straight after finishing reading Pride and Prejudice for the read-along. And what I really loved about Death Comes to Pemberley is the way it gave a very good summary at the start of the contents of the story Pride and Prejudice. So if you haven't read Pride and Prejudice and you do not intend to, you could get quite a succinct version of the story from listening to Death Comes to Pemberley and the early chapters. But I would say this is probably more enjoyable if you have actually read Pride and Prejudice. It really is quite a good book for revisiting the characters. That element of it I really liked. It was interesting to take characters that you know, Lizzie Bennet, Jane Bennet, Mr. Darcy, Mr. Bingley, and so on, and talk about their lives after the events of Pride and Prejudice. I did like that element of it. I didn't think the mystery element was particularly strong. I wasn't a huge fan of it, and the further on the book went, the more boring it got, unfortunately. So I did finish listening to it because it was quite a short listen. I have read other P.D. James books before, ordinary crime books, and so far I haven't actually liked any P.D. James. So I am going to chalk this one up to didn't particularly care for it. But it was a fun book if you like Pride and Prejudice and you like murder mysteries. Also read the short story collection by Maggie Shipstead, You Have a Friend in 10A. I think part of the reason I didn't enjoy this so much was because I had too high expectations for this one. I loved Great Circle so much, but I do think that Maggie Shipstead is probably better at sprawling epic books than she is at short stories, and I mean no offence by that. I am a lover of short stories, and this collection for me didn't have any amazing standout story in it, which I always look for in a short story collection. The second story was probably my very favourite. That was called Acknowledgements, and it was about a writer, and I do really like stories about writers, so I enjoyed that one. The opening story, The Cowboy Tango, is also very good. And there's a very strange story in here called La Moretta, which I found very shocking and brutal, but also it did make me think about it, and I enjoyed the different writing style of that one. There were a couple of other stories that were good, and the rest were really just okay for me. They didn't do a lot for me, unfortunately. I read this as a buddy read with the lovely Charlie from Charlie Brooke. Definitely check out her channel in the description down below. I would still give Maggie Shipstead's other novels a chance, and if she brings out new novels I will definitely read them, but I possibly wouldn't buy another book of hers that was a short story collection. So moving on to very good books. There's two books here that I'm a little bit ambivalent between good and very good, and both of them I listened to on audiobook, but I also did have the ebook so that I could find out more if I wanted to. And I'm going to talk about these both together because I only read them because they were recently announced on the Booker Prize long list. So I listened to the two very shortest books on the long list. I listened to Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, and I listened to Treacle Walker by Alan Garner. If I had to read one again, I would probably choose to read Treacle Walker again because it was so weird and so out there that I would probably read it again to try and get a better understanding, because I don't feel I fully got Treacle Walker and I would like to get it, but it was an enjoyable, fun book. The strange thing about Treacle Walker was that I felt unsure about whether it was a children's book because it sort of read a bit like a children's book from like the 60s, 70s or 80s, but I enjoyed that sort of nostalgia of it. It's a book about a boy called Joe who meets a rag and bone man, Treacle Walker, and Treacle Walker kind of gifts Joe with almost like, I suppose, a second sight. It's very, I expect it's very mythological, but I don't know which myths it draws from. There was some nature writing, there was some stuff with a comic which I really enjoyed, But like I said, I don't think I really got this book, but it's a really, really interesting read. And at only 2 hours long, I highly, highly recommend the audiobook. I will put the narrator's name on the screen somewhere because I can't remember it. But he did a great job of doing different accents for different characters, and I thought it was a very well put together audiobook. And there are certainly worse ways to spend 2 hours. So I do recommend that one if you like things that are a bit weird. The other one, Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. This is a really lovely book, I would say. It feels quite gentle. Surprising to see them on the booker list because they are so short, and I find with short books it can be difficult to decide, like, is this great or not? Again, this was a 2-hour audiobook, and this is set in Ireland, and the writing is really beautiful writing by Claire Keegan. I hadn't read anything by her before, and some of what she writes is very nice. The book content didn't particularly do much for me. This is sort of a Christmassy story. It kind of made me think of other Christmassy tales, a bit like It's a Wonderful Life or A Christmas Carol. It kind of has that thinking about the past type element for the main character. And even though I listened to this really, really recently, I'm not really sure I have that much more to say about it. So that's those two. Another really, really short book that I got through, there's definitely a theme of short books in this month, was Assembly by Natasha Brown. I'd wanted to pick this up ever since I read the blurb for it for the Booktuber prize back in sort of January, February time. And I believe this is meant to be a bit like Mrs. Dalloway, which I haven't read, so it probably would help if I had actually read Mrs. Dalloway. I can't really say anything about this book without spoiling it, I feel. So what I am going to say about it is that it wasn't what I expected. There's a massive element to this that was totally hit me out of the blue and I didn't expect at all. It's definitely a very interesting little read, and I can see why this has been made a big fuss of, but it was another book that I came away from feeling really unsure how to feel about. On to some bigger books. I read this one with Berna from Berna's Bookish Adventures. We've had I think 3 buddy reads now, and this one again was very, very enjoyable. I do love reading with Berna, and if you haven't checked out her channel, do go and check it out in the links down below. And we read 9 Perfect Strangers by Liane Moriarty, and I think this was probably the 4th Liane Moriarty book I've read. I didn't love it as much as I love Big Little Lies, which I think is her best book. I also don't think I enjoyed it as much as Truly Madly Guilty, which I also enjoyed. This is a very strange book, but it was a real breath of fresh air for me at a time when I was reading 2 classics at once, and this felt like a really light read in comparison. I really enjoyed the pace Berna and I were going at. I wouldn't really call it a mystery book, but it's a book that's full of sort of smaller mysteries, and as the title suggests, there are at least 9 characters in this, 9 strangers. In fact, because the 9 strangers are brought together at a health spa, there are also 3 members of staff to that health spa who feature. And different chapters are told from the perspective of different ones of those people. I think this is probably a bit of a Marmite book, and I don't think it's Liane Moriarty's best, but I really had great fun reading this with Berna. It had surprises, it had romance, and it had mystery, and yeah, I just thought this was a really fun book, and it really put me in the mood for thrillers. This book is responsible for an accidental thriller binge that I went on. Not getting on to any more thrillers yet, but next up I'm going to talk quickly about Six Tudor Queens, Catherine of Aragon, the True Queen by Alison Weir. As you know, I had been reading this for 2 months, maybe even 3 months. I know I'm behind with this read along. I'd been reading this for several months with the Tudor Along hosted by Gem of Books, Dani's Book World and Novelle Novels. I think we were meant to finish this book in June and I finished it in July. And the reason for taking so long to finish it and finishing it in July is because I found the middle part of this book quite draggy. It seems to go on for a very long time, and I really do think, and a lot of people agreed with me in the group, that this book could be at least 100 pages shorter, I think. But I do like what Alison Weir has done. I think she has made history very, very accessible in this. It was pretty easy to read other than when it got a bit slow. But I think it is a deliberate decision to go slowly because of the sheer length of time that Catherine of Aragon is kind of left waiting about in her life with Henry VIII. And this is one of the books that I actually acquired this month. I was previously reading a library copy, and I met up with the lovely Gemma from Gemma Books, and she kindly donated me her copy so that I could get this finished. So I really appreciate that, and it doesn't need to add to the giant TBR because I have finished it. Yay! When I became in the mood for reading thrillers, I didn't know at first that it was going to be a thriller reading binge, but I started off with Verity by Colleen Hoover, and I've never read a Colleen Hoover book, and from what people are saying I probably won't read another one because I think all the others are romances. But I read Verity. I read Verity because two of my friends on BookTube had been talking about this one, talking about how shocking it is, and I was so drawn in, I had to read it. And this was a sort of read in a day book. I started it at 7 o'clock one night. I finished it the next morning because I had to stop with about 50 pages to go to sleep. This is like a really, really quick book to read. I don't think Verity would win any award for literary merit, but it is such a fast-paced thriller. The opening was so shocking that I was quite taken aback by it, but I really appreciated the storyline. I think that although there were some things that were very difficult to read in terms of content, it was very easy to read in terms of consumption, and I could not stop reading Verity. Those last 50 pages, wow. I can't really say any more about Verity without potentially spoiling it, but I did really enjoy this as a quick, mysterious thriller that just keeps you turning the pages. Okay, next we come to another thriller that I read on my thriller binge, and this one was sent to me for my birthday by the lovely Jack at Spread Book Joy, and Jack sent me this, A Good Girl's Guide to Murder by Holly Jackson, and there's another book in the pile later from Jack as well. Thank you, Jack, for sending those. And I read A Good Girl's Guide to Murder almost straight after getting it. It wasn't quite exactly as I expected. I would definitely read the rest of the series. It's quite a fun sort of YA book about a teenage girl trying to solve like a closed past case. It was quite dramatic. There were bits I was definitely expecting and saw coming, and bits I didn't. The one thing that really let this book down for me was an incident with a pet, which I won't say what it was because I don't want to spoil it, but I really don't like books where pets are harmed, and a pet was harmed. So that's possibly just me, but I didn't think it was for a good reason personally. I didn't like that about it, but I did like the general story. Next, I'm going to show Pride and Prejudice. I finally read Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and this is one I have actually talked about in a video, a bit of a discussion video I did about burning questions about Jane Austen that I had after reading Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice definitely grew on me as I read it. I didn't really enjoy it at the beginning of the read-along, and I was reading this along with a Goodreads group. It was run by the hosts of Jane Austen July, Katie at Books and Things, Claudia at Spinster's Library, and Marissa at Blatantly Bookish. I was surprised at how much I didn't like Lizzie in the beginning, and I've already talked about this elsewhere, so I won't go on and on about it. But Lizzie did redeem herself towards the end of the book for me, and I do think this is a very good book, rightly lauded as a classic. But for me, it isn't my favourite Jane Austen. It isn't even my second favourite Jane Austen, but I had a good enough time reading it. It's not surprising that by the end of the Maggie Shipstead I was a bit bored of short stories, because I also read another short story collection this month, which is After Party Stories by Anthony Wiesner. And this is the debut short story collection by this author, who has sadly since passed away. You can see from these stories that he was a very, very talented young writer. And I read this book for a project that I'm still working on, that I definitely will tell you about soon. All of the short stories were similar in feel. They all offer sort of insight into the lives of Cambodian Americans, and they all offer different characters within that community, different scenarios within that community. It's set in California. I thought this was a really, really interesting collection, and I could see why it had made it onto the list that I was reading the book from. Again, this wasn't a book where I thought there was particularly a massively standout story, but I thought these were all so well written. A really interesting style. And I liked the opening story, which was called Three Women of Chuck's Donuts. And I really liked what some of the other short stories were doing, although I wouldn't describe them as particular favourites. Last of all, in my very good category, before we move on to favourites of the month, and this was my second present from Jack over at Spread Book Joy, so thank you, Jack. And Jack sent me The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Now, I think I was probably the only person on BookTube who had never read a Taylor Jenkins Reid book, but now I have, because I've read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. And I do own the audiobook of Daisy Jones and the Six and do intend to listen to that. It's been bumped up my list of priorities even more by having read this. I don't think this book needs much of an introduction, but it is about the titular Evelyn Hugo and her seven husbands, and she is now nearly 80 and was a Hollywood sort of icon and is now giving her story to a young journalist. And I thought this book was really well worked. Again, I read this quite quickly. I thought it was very page turning, kept me wanting more, and there was sort of a little mystery element that kind of made me want to keep reading quite a lot. And I thought the character of Evelyn Hugo was really, really fascinating as well. If you haven't read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, I do highly recommend it. I think it's a really interesting work of sort of historical fiction of recent times and Hollywood. You will have noticed that quite a lot of these books did not feature on my July TBR, and that's because I did really mood read with like picking up lots of thrillers, because that's what I felt like doing, so sometimes you have to do that. But in my favourites of the month, there would be one book that was on my TBR for the month, and that was Persuasion by Jane Austen. This is definitely up there as one of my favourite Jane Austens. I reread Persuasion for the Persuasionalong, which was hosted by Jack at Spread Book Joy and Gemma at Gemma Books, and I really, really still loved Persuasion. I thought it was great. In fact, I probably loved it even more the second time around. So this is now up there with Emma as one of my favourite Jane Austens, and at the moment this would probably pip Emma to the post. I did also, for Jane Austen July, watch two adaptations of Persuasion, so I'm a bit persuasioned out at the moment. I watched the new Netflix adaptation of 2022 and I watched the 1995 version. If you want to find out what I thought of those two adaptations, go and check out the video I have made comparing the two of them to the source material. Suffice it to say, I loved rereading Persuasion. I have two more physical books to talk about and one audiobook, and I think this is roughly the order of how much I loved them. The first one was given to me by the lovely Gemma Books. She also donated me her copy of this, and I'm really, really glad that Gemma gave me this copy because this was absolutely fantastic. And again, read this in a day. So this is the graphic memoir The Roles We Play by Saba Khan, and this won the Jalak Prize this year. I can see why this won the Jalak Prize. It is an absolutely brilliant book. So if you can get your hands on a copy of this and you like reading graphic memoirs, I would definitely recommend this. What I really, really loved about this book was, in a really, really accessible way in pictures, it told me so much about India and Pakistan and Kashmir, and particularly this chapter, Rocks, taught me so much about partition and what happens to displace so many people from the Kashmiri region. So the artwork in this is really stunning at times, and I found it to be beautiful. A lot of Saba Khan's work is talking about belonging within a family, within a community, and her life and how she has coped with her identity and her various different identities that exist within herself. I thought this was a really, really excellent book. It made me definitely want to read more graphic biographies because I was amazed at how much I could learn from a book that was telling me things predominantly through pictures. And also, this is just a great book, so I do really recommend this. I felt like for a book I had read in a day, I had learnt more than I have learnt from a book in a very long time, so highly recommend that one, and it was a definite favourite. So thank you, Gemma, for passing that one on to me. Now, when I met up with Gemma, we did go book shopping, but I was restrained and I bought one book. And this is the book that I bought. It was also a favourite of the month, and that was Girl Forgotten by Karin Slaughter. This is sort of a sequel to a Karin Slaughter book I read earlier this year called Pieces of Her, which also had a Netflix adaptation, which I didn't enjoy. It is a sequel in the sense that it is about one of the characters from Pieces of Her. It's about Andrea Oliver. And Andrea Oliver was sort of one of the main characters in that book, and she is the main character in this book. But in common with that book, it also has a sort of past timeline about a girl who was murdered, and her timeline is included because that is a sort of cold case that Andy is investigating, because she has become I think she's become a US Marshal. I really enjoyed this. For Karin Slaughter, this was very not too graphic in its descriptions of violence. There was violence, there was probably endless trigger warnings in this, as usual with Karin Slaughter, but I did think it was probably down a notch from Pieces of Her, and certainly nowhere near as violent as the Grant County series and the Will Trent books, which I love anyway. But I did really enjoy it. I think Andy Oliver is a great character. I enjoyed revisiting some of the other characters who were in the previous book. At first I thought that the storyline was a bit too similar to the Pieces of Her, the structure of the Pieces of Her book. I thought it was kind of just a rehash of it at first, but then it wasn't. I really enjoyed this and really enjoyed Andrea's investigation. It definitely made me want to read even more Karin Slaughter. I do still have a few left on my giant TBR, so that's good. My top favourite of the month is actually a book that I started last month, and it was an audiobook, and it was Project Hail Mary by Anne Weir. Now, the only thing stopping Project Hail Mary by Anne Weir from being like an absolute 5-star book is that it's a little bit too sciencey for me. I know it's science fiction, but at times I felt a bit bogged down in the science. But the rest of the time, I loved this book. I loved the two main characters. Absolutely fantastically done. I won't give any spoilers. The audiobook is absolutely fantastic. If you are interested in this book and you love audiobooks, this one's a really good one. It had some great sound effects. It had a narrator who I thought was really well matched to the sort of comedy in the story, the humour, and I thought he portrayed the main character really well. So yeah, really enjoyed that, and that was my first Anne Weir book, so I will definitely read more of those. That is everything that I read. 17 books, so this has probably been going on a very long time. Yeah, I did obtain 6 books this month. I thought I had bought the 6th one up to show, but I seem to have not done that. But that was Everyone in This Room Will One Day Be Dead by Emily Austen. I'll have to show that in a separate video because I don't have it on me. At the end of last month, the giant TBR stood at 189. I did manage to read 5 out of the 6 books that I hauled, and I did read 4 books that were on the giant TBR, which were The Secret House of Death, Verity, You Have a Friend in 10A, and 9 Perfect Strangers. Because I have gained 1 book, I do need to take that off the 4, so I will take 3 off the giant TBR, which brings it down to 186. So I'm hoping for some more progress in August on the giant TBR, and I may be going to do another try a chapter and unhaul video in August, I think, to get the numbers down a little bit. But anyway, that's all for today from my very long July wrap up. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please do give it a like. Please do consider subscribing if you haven't already, and please do let me know in the comments down below what were your favourite books of July, and have you got any fun reading plans for August. Thanks for watching today, and I hope very much to see you all again soon for another video all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.